Hello, Montana, and hello, world. I'm Chris Hislop from the Montana World Affairs Council, and this is Connect Montana, where we bring the world to Montana and Montana to the world. We're right in the middle of our spring series of webcasts. If you've missed any of the previous shows, check us out on YouTube. We've had some great discussions, including with former Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel. Connect Montana brings issues that are important to Montana and to Montanans, and this includes a range of Indigenous issues. You may have joined us when Ellie Bundy from the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes spoke to us on missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people. We had Ivan McDonald from the Montana Racial Equity Project on the global equity movement and how it relates to Black and Indigenous Lives Matter here in Montana. We also welcomed Diana Bird from the Cuts Wood School in Browning, who is this year's Global Educator of the Year. Diana has spent her life teaching Blackfeet language to people from Montana and around the world. So today we're going to continue that conversation with some of our friends from Australia. But first, let me thank our very generous sponsors, the Dennis and Phyllis Washington Foundation, Stockman Bank, and Allegiance. Now, after I introduce our guests, I just want to remind viewers that we'll have about 20 minutes where our guests will be speaking, and that's followed by a question and answer period. And you're welcome to chat in questions to me using the chat function at the bottom of your screen. You can move your mouse around to find the chat or touch your screen, click on chat, and type in a question. I will curate those questions, asking our guests those questions that relate to the topic. My colleague Julie Heaton will also be chatting in some messages for you, giving you some additional information, and also asking you if you would like to receive a message after this with some additional information from our guests and from their project. So look for that in the chat box. Now let me introduce our guests. Caitlyn Reiger is an Australian human rights lawyer and transitional justice specialist who has spent the past 20 years working around the world on access to justice for marginalized groups, specifically helping countries to address the legacy of mass atrocities. She has worked in war criminal tribunals with various agencies of the United Nations, international think tanks, and aid programs, whether training lawyers or judges, advocating for policy change, or listening to victims of human rights violations tell their stories. She co-founded the Judicial System Monitoring Program in Timor-Leste, edited a book on prosecuting heads of state, and ran a public awareness social media campaign in Myanmar on legal aid and access to justice. She is currently supporting the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria to design, in partnership with the state government, Australia's first Truth Commission to examine the impact of colonization on its First Peoples. She has a BA LLB from the University of Melbourne and LLM from international law from the London School of Economics and Political Science. Our next guest is Georgia Cromarty. She is a Central and Eastern Arenda woman from Central Australia. She has a Bachelor of Arts in Political Studies from the University of Melbourne and has been working in the community sector for a number of years. Georgia currently works in the policy team at the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria, providing cultural and political advice to the treaty process. Most recently, Georgia was part of a team that helped to establish Australia's first Truth and Justice Commission. Previously, Georgia worked on the Victoria Electoral Commission, embedding self-determination within election processes in Victoria and providing electoral services to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities in Victoria, as well as contributing to electoral policy in the Indigenous space at the national level. So welcome, Caitlyn and Georgia, all the way from the other side of the world. Thank you so much for joining us here on Connect Montana. How are you?
Very well, thanks, Chris. Very nice to be here and to join everyone.
And Georgia, how are you today?
I'm good, thank you. I'm actually working from Cuba at the moment, so I'm closer to you than I am to Caitlyn right now.
Yes.
But doing very well.
I love that. It's the wonders of technology. Here we are in increasingly, it's small. The world is getting smaller. What I wanted to kick things off with, Georgia and Caitlyn, was to say that we promote our events on social media, and we get a lot of interesting comments here and there. But I have to say that for this event, we had a particularly interesting group of comments and people who were interested in this program. Now, it doesn't surprise me at all because it's a hugely fascinating topic. So you have a lot of interested people here who've logged on to listen to you. Could we hear a little bit more about Yoo-Rrook and what it means for Australia, but maybe also what it might mean for America? So over to you, please.
Thanks, Chris. Before we actually talk in detail about Yoo-Rrook and what's actually happening here in the state of Victoria, I'm actually going to get Georgia to kick things off. First with an acknowledgement of country and a little bit of background for those who don't know necessarily that much about how these issues are relevant in Australia first before we can connect it back to Montana and the rest of the world. Over to you, Georgia.
Thanks, Caitlyn. Yeah, we're all good to go. Cool. So yeah, my name is Georgia. I'm a Central and Eastern Arrernte woman. So that's the Central Desert of Australia. I work for the First Peoples Assembly, which is a democratically elected body in the state of Victoria made up of traditional owners of country. And the Assembly are the voice of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Victoria during the treaty process. So as Caitlyn said, I'd like to start with an acknowledgement of country. So why do we do this? Aboriginal people have really clear boundaries separating their countries, despite a lack of fences and all those sorts of things. When another group wanted to cross into another country, they would ask permission. The hosting group, after granting permission, would offer them safe passage and protection. Oh no. Sorry, and protection of their spiritual being. So a welcome to country is performed at events now by traditional owners of country on which the event is taking place. This can take the form of singing, dancing, smoking ceremonies, or a speech in a traditional language or English. So in lieu of a traditional owner actually being, of the relevant country being present, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples in Australia will begin most formal events with an acknowledgement of country. It acknowledges the continuing connection that First Nations people have to land and waters, and more often than not will recognise that sovereignty was never ceded. So I'd like to offer this acknowledgement not just for First Nations people in Australia, but across the world, because the truth is we're all on Indigenous land. So I'd like to acknowledge the First Nations people across the world, beginning with my ancestors on Arrernte country in the Central Desert of Australia. First Nations people have cared for their lands for many thousands of years and continue to do so despite the widespread and ongoing impact of violent colonial practices across the globe. I'd like to acknowledge that more often than not, First Nations people never ceded sovereignty. I pay my respects to elders, past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge First Nations people's continuing connection to their land and waters. So as Caitlyn said, I'm going to give a little bit of a background of the process and how we got to where we are with the launch of the Yoo-Rrook Justice Commission. So the experience of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in Australia is a quite different experience from other colonised lands, especially those in the Commonwealth, which is obviously primarily made up of former British territories. While other First Nations people have entered into treaties or been given back lands and reserves, the Australian government has continuously refused to work with First Nations people in Australia until very, very recently. It wasn't until the 60s that Australia started listening. An Arrernte man, my uncle Charles Perkins, held a freedom ride through towns in Australia that exposed to the nation the terrible living conditions of Aboriginal peoples and the racism that remained prevalent in Australian society, which was obviously inspired by a similar movement in the States. It wasn't until 1962 that Aboriginal people were granted the right to vote. And in 1967, the federal government held a referendum to amend the constitution that meant that Aboriginal people were actually counted in the census. So for a little bit of context, that's almost 100 years after the 14th Amendment repealed the 3/5 compromise. However, I will acknowledge that I don't know about different laws made for Native American peoples. So in the midst of the Black Lives Matter movement last year, truth-telling became part of the conversation again. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture is kept at the peripheries of Australian culture. Until December last year, our national anthem said Australia was young and free. And this is obviously directly contradicted by a history of First Nations people, colonisation and ongoing injustices against First Nations people in Australia. The change of our national anthem from young and free to one and free, while in my opinion is a token gesture at best, is an example of a changing national mindset toward telling the truth of Australia's colonial history. So Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia have long called for a truth-telling process and for treaties, while our neighbour down under, New Zealand, has had the Treaty of Waitangi in place since 1840. Australia is yet to have any treaties at a local, state or national level. The national Liberal government, different from America, the Liberal government down here, the right-leaning Conservative government, have all but ruled out treaties at a national level. However, the left-leaning Labor government in the state of Victoria began the process of treaties a few years ago. The Assembly were elected in December of 2019, the First People's Assembly, and have been progressing the treaty conversations with the state government ever since. The Assembly is not starting from scratch. It has the momentum of decades of Aboriginal activism in this space behind it. Most recently, in 2017, the First Nations Constitutional Convention was held near Uluru in Central Australia. Uluru being, which you may know as Rock, but Uluru is the traditional name for it, and it's the big rock in the middle of Australia. After consulting with First Nations people across the country, the conference brought groups together and they issued what is known as the Uluru Statement from the Heart. The Uluru Statement calls for a First Nations voice in the Australian Constitution and a Makarrata Commission to supervise a process of agreement making and truth-telling between the Australian government and First Nations peoples. Makarrata is the Yolngu word meaning coming together after a struggle or essentially treaty. The Uluru Statement from the Heart was rejected by the national government, and so treaties and the truth-telling processes are now beginning at state levels. In June 2020, in the midst of the Black Lives Matter movement, the Assembly passed a resolution calling on the state government of Victoria to commit to a truth-telling process as part of the treaty process. The state government agreed to work with the Assembly on this, and we're now close to the establishment of the first truth-telling commission in Australia, the Yoo-Rrook Justice Commission. Yoo-Rrook is a Wemba Wemba word, Wemba Wemba being a nation within the state of Victoria, and it means truth. I will now hand over to Caitlyn after that background mission together within the Assembly.
Thank you, Georgia. And I'm speaking from the Kulin Nation, Wurundjeri land, which is what covers the modern city of Melbourne. So Yoo-Rrook, as Georgia mentioned, means truth. The Yoo-Rrook Justice Commission is really encapsulating the idea behind what this body is intended to do. So, you know, in some countries like South Africa or Canada as well, it was described as a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. In Australia, the word reconciliation has a quite often contested history in terms of dashed hopes from Aboriginal people in terms of what reconciliation is often supposed to mean. And so the focus on justice was a really key part of developing this commission. So as Georgia kind of laid out, this is a state initiative. It's not a federal effort. And I do know, and maybe we can come in the questions, that there are a lot of even more localized efforts taking place across the US right now around systemic racial injustice to set up even more localized truth commissions. But this is one that is at state government level, so one level down from federal. But there are other states in Australia that are now also starting to think about both treaty and truth telling. And so we are all being watched pretty closely here in Victoria to see how this one goes. So the First People's Assembly, as the elected body, has been working with the state government essentially in partnership to design the Truth Commission, which already is a pretty revolutionary step. Terms of reference were put together by the Assembly, put out for public comment over the course of late last year. And now there's been a process of working through how to actually get the body set up. Many truth commissions in other countries around the world are created by legislation. In Canada, for example, the Truth Commission was actually created just as an agreement between the government and First Peoples, but it was as a result of litigation around the residential schools system there. So here it's being done slightly differently again. There's already an existing legal framework for setting up commissions of inquiry. So formal state investigations, often which are called royal commissions here. So the decision has been here to use that existing legal framework because it allowed this to move a lot faster, but also because it gives the body really strong powers. It gives it the strongest coercive powers to go where it needs to go, to find the documents it needs, to compel testimony if it needs to, and to be taken seriously in what it does. So the announcement came out just 2 weeks ago. So this is a very timely chance to be able to share information with all of you. It's not fully public yet. What's been announced so far is also a pretty landmark aspect of the process, and that is that the commission will be led by 5 commissioners, and they are being selected through an open and transparent selection process. So there's a call for expressions of interest. That's what was launched 2 weeks ago for people to lead this. And normally these official inquiries in Australia, at least, are done without that kind of transparency. There's appointments made behind the scenes. So this is already about trying to build legitimacy in the community, make this a participatory process. And once the process for identifying the commissioners is made, then the commission will be formally established and its full terms of reference can be published. We'll share in the chat the summary information that's available so far. So what will the commission do? It's tasked with basically establishing an official record of what happened and what happened in relation to the impact of colonisation on First Peoples in Victoria, using primarily First Peoples' own stories and their own voices. As Georgia mentioned, there's long histories, and the cultural way of transmitting knowledge is very often oral transmission. Many of these stories may not have been recorded or recognised formally until now, although they have, of course, been passed on through community. But the broader non-Indigenous community is still often very largely ignorant about the reality of how Australia was colonised. We often use very benign words like settled, the fact that there were frontier massacres, there were all sorts of atrocities that took place, is still something that many people are reluctant to bring into the light, and conflicts with Australia's, I think, preferred way of presenting itself to the world as a nice established human rights respecting democracy. So the body, its mandate is going to be to look at these historical injustices. That's a key part of it that will involve research, but also looking at what other material's been done, but also hearing those passed on stories. But very importantly, and maybe relevantly for debates in the US as well, the body will also have a mandate to look at ongoing systemic injustice against First Peoples. And that's really key in terms of being able to expose the linkages between historical trauma, the intergenerational impact of that, and how that still plays out today in terms of discrimination, in terms of disadvantage, and in terms of lived experiences of those things. So those linkages between the past and the present, and then the last part of the body's work is about the future. So the body will be tasked with creating, a comprehensive record and report, but it is very clear that this needs to lead to meaningful change, and that's one of the key messages we've been hearing in the consultations we've been doing with community over the last several months. That there's been many inquiries, more narrow targeted things, looking at, for example, deaths of Aboriginal people in custody or the removal of Aboriginal children in what's known as the stolen generations in Australia. But those recommendations have still not been implemented in many cases. So lots of great reports, lots of great recommendations, but where's the real change on the ground? And so this body is being asked to identify very specific forms of redress for historical injustice, as well as how to address the ongoing issues. And that's systemic, very systemic law reform, policy reform. What does the state need to do? What do private institutions need to do? How to change history curriculum and how that's taught in Australian schools, and many other things, potentially broader reparations programs. We'll see where the body goes. So it will hopefully be kicking off in about mid-year, and it's been given a mandate initially of about 3 years, although that could be extended. A couple of other just notable things at the high level in terms of the body is that even though it's focused on, it's a domestic process, it's using Australian legal frameworks, it's also recognising that this is part of a global movement, and so it's very clearly also referencing international law standards, particularly the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, as well as other important human rights legal frameworks from elsewhere, including the Genocide Convention. The debate about whether or not genocide took place in Australia is something that this body will need to engage with, and as well as the rights of people everywhere if they have suffered human rights violations, serious human rights violations, to an effective remedy and to preventing these things taking place in the future. So it's drawn on international experience. We've been looking at experiences of truth commissions in many countries, particularly First Nations contexts like Canada. There's also been a couple of truth commissions in the US that have been looked at as well, in Greensboro, in North Carolina, and also in Maine as well. And so all of those experiences are coming together, but it's also, I think, a new experiment in how this model of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission or a Truth and Justice Commission can address these much longer term colonial legacies. So in Australia, this is going to look back to the beginning of colonisation, which is in Victoria at least 230 years old. So I will stop there and maybe I hand back to you, Chris, if you have particular questions for either of us or if we're opening it up.
Very good. Thank you for that, Caitlyn. I'm going to get us all up on screen here, the three of us, because what is happening now is we are getting some questions in on the chat from our participants. I just want to remind everybody who's viewing out there that on your screen, if you're not familiar with it, on the bottom or possibly on the top is a small icon of a little cartoon bubble that says chat. And you're welcome to click that, and then you can type in a question. I will receive those questions, and then we can use those in our discussion. Fortunately, there's always been more questions than there has been time on Connect Montana. So let me kick off. We have a number already from participants. So I'm going to kick a few of these out, and I'm going to throw some of my stuff in too, because I hate to miss a chance to talk about such interesting work. Question from our audience. I'm wondering if the commission has Aboriginal people on it.
So the 5 commissioners that will lead this body, a majority of those need to be Aboriginal. At least 2 of those need to be Victorian traditional owners, and at least 1 of those needs to be an elder. So that's definitely embedded into the design of this process. They haven't yet been selected, but yeah.
Okay. The next question from audience member, by the way, Caitlyn and Georgia, maybe I'll just throw these out there and you can decide who's best placed to respond, or if you'd both like to respond, of course, that's fine. Is there any interest by the federal government to adopt a similar approach nationwide?
Georgia, you want to take that?
As I mentioned in the background, not particularly. Australia has the Liberal government is in power right now, which is quite a conservative government who have rejected several or all sections of the Uluru Statement from the Heart. So the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which called for the truth-telling process as well as a First Nations representative voice to Parliament, was very much rejected by the Liberal government. There was a big conversation about Aboriginal people requesting a third chamber of Parliament, essentially, which obviously wasn't what was happening, and that kind of had the conversation dead in the water for quite a while. The reason this is happening at a state level is because of the federal government's unwillingness to support this kind of process. But hopefully in the future that will change.
Very interesting. I mean, nothing is entirely free from the politics of a place. And I imagine that it's, there's very complex, not just federal, but state politics on this issue. Here's another question. Will the commission develop or have public engagement and a communications plan, for example, in arts, education, media, and storytelling? If so, would this possibly happen concurrently, or is it likely only something to include in recommendations afterward?
That's a really great question. And definitely it needs to be happening throughout the Commission's life. The Commission is going to be tasked with significant community engagement responsibility, and including use of media and other things. But I would expect that there would also be recommendations around how to embed that more fully. But, I think one of the challenges for any of these kinds of mechanisms is how you engage the public's imagination. If the objective is to create a shared narrative and a new understanding of our history, that can't be done without without arts and culture and all of those ways in which people actually help shape their ideas of their society. Georgia, I don't know what your views are on that.
Yeah, no, look, the commission itself, I kind of will see as primarily being a really large community engagement campaign. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia have been truth telling for a really, really long time. It isn't new, and it's the commission's job to pull those stories out of community and into the general public in Victoria and Australia. I really think it'll be really interesting seeing how the commission handles public engagement during while it's operating as well as after, because it does really have two different segments of society coming together. It's this makarrata of coming together after a struggle. The Aboriginal community are obviously on board with the idea of truth telling, but there's a lot of trauma there, and so the process needs to be done in a correct way to avoid re-traumatization. It also needs to be done in a way that brings the rest of the public in Victoria in on this journey with us, because they're really the ones that need to be learning these stories. So it's going to be a really delicate balance, I think, between ensuring that it's a safe and culturally appropriate procedure for community, and also ensuring that they're doing it in a way where the non-Aboriginal population in Australia feel that they're able to participate in it as well and learn from it.
And it is anticipated that there would be public hearings as well as potentially some confidential hearings, depending on the subject matter and the cultural considerations that Georgia was talking about, but certainly a significant component would be public.
So, Georgia, maybe a question from my side. There will be a question here somewhere. I'm not sure. I'm going to kind of dig around and see if I can arrive at a point. But I want to pick up on the non-Aboriginal point that you made and this importance of engagement and some kind of a balance and so on. From this end of it, you're just commencing now. What is your impression on how to engage the non-Aboriginal? I mean, Caitlyn, you mentioned in your opening remarks, maybe in Australia, there hasn't been the best kind of history teaching about the way things have happened in the country. And so there isn't maybe the best basis for this kind of engagement in non-Aboriginal communities, or maybe there is. What is your impression kind of from on the outset side of things on how that's going to happen? And also, what do you think, what are the pitfalls? What are the great possibilities?
Yeah, no, that is a really, really interesting question, and it'll be interesting to see how that unfolds. As I mentioned before, that this is the Australian general public coming to terms with its Black history, using that word in both of its contexts, is very new. 1967 was not very long ago in terms of actually being considered in the census. And at that stage during that referendum was where the federal government were then able to also make laws that impacted Aboriginal people. So it really, really, they weren't integrated into society until, or we weren't until 1967, you know, which is obviously, you know, my grandmother. It wasn't something that you talked about. If you could get away with not the public not knowing you were Aboriginal, then that's what you did. Because as Caitlyn mentioned earlier, there were stolen generations within Australia, which is where the government took away Aboriginal children who may have had one white parent and raised them within white society, taking them away from their culture and family. So this is a really, really new conversation, not in Aboriginal culture, obviously, but in the culture outside of that, in the general Australian culture, which, you know, very much likes to see itself as this kind of friendly little nation down at the bottom of the world, that kind of gets along with anyone, human rights, you know, democracy. We love all of these values. And so our history really, really doesn't reflect that. And it's a conversation that is very new. I think even being an Aboriginal person myself, it took a really long time to be able to understand my culture and where I'd come from, because none of that information is taught in our schools. You learn a very, very small amount about you know, Dreamtime stories, which are kind of creation stories told to explain how different things have happened, how the land has come to be how it is, and our connections with each other. But really, that conversation is not happening, and I think that it needs to happen. A lot of feedback that we've gotten from community, a significant amount, has said this needs to start in schools. We can't be bringing people into this conversation when they're already in adulthood for the coming generations. That it needs to be embedded within our curriculum at a really, really young age, and I think that's going to be really, really important. You know, I've had a lot of non-Aboriginal friends say that they didn't really learn any of these things until they got to university. And university is obviously pretty late in their lives, and obviously a lot of people don't go to university. And so we need to be making sure that we're embedding it at all levels of education. I think that's probably going to be the best way to bring it into the greater Australian consciousness.
Mm-hmm. Here's another question from the audience. And if you don't know the answer to this, which you may not, I'd like to redirect it to the audience itself. It asks, do you know of initiatives to start a truth and reconciliation finding process in our state of Montana as well? And if so, where does it stand currently?
Caitlyn?
I don't know of anything in Montana specifically, but I do have some colleagues who are working on some other similar processes in many cities and states around the US, but I haven't heard of anything in Montana. I'm happy to be corrected though.
Okay, well, I'm also happy to get any more information. If anybody who's viewing this has some input on that question, please chat it into me. I'll share it with everybody. Next question. This is to both speakers. How would you describe the level of support among Aboriginal communities in Victoria for the treaty process and for the truth and the TJC process? Yeah.
Yep, that's a really complex question, and a very interesting one, and an ongoing conversation. As I mentioned earlier, these kind of processes are going to bring out a lot of trauma, and different Aboriginal groups within Victoria have completely different experiences of colonisation. And across Australia. So the east coast of Australia was particularly hit by colonisation, whereas kind of the further west you go, it's a really, really different experience of colonisation. Culture is maybe, language is more commonly known there. Culture is practiced because that people weren't removed as much, and they have managed to maintain to a larger extent their connections with country and culture. And this is kind of across Australia and across Victoria, that people have really, really differing experiences of colonization and of, how a healing process should take place. So while I would say that there is general support in the Aboriginal community within Victoria for the truth-telling process, treaty as well. However, there is at least one nation who has chosen not to have a seat at the table in the First Peoples Assembly. It is very interesting thinking about this. Caitlyn, I don't know if you want to take over, but
just I know I think you've touched on it. I mean, many people say that Victorian Aboriginal politics is so complex because of the nature of how colonization took place. People were removed off their land onto missions or reservations, mixed together in different groups, and so it's very different from areas where there's sort of more ongoing connection that's possible, and that plays out, of course, in modern politics as well. But the advantage, I guess, of how this process here has developed is that you have the First Peoples Assembly, which is an elected representative body. As Georgia said, it doesn't necessarily represent everybody, but it has 31 elected members who represent different traditional owner groups, different parts of the state. And there's differing views, but they've come together to support this process and have backed it and have played a leading role in driving it. But the treaty process is what will come after. And I think that's something we haven't talked about so much so far, that this is also very unique for a truth and reconciliation process, to have treaty coming in behind it that will help enforce what the recommendations say. So if there's recommendations for, control, separate court system, for example, or who should be teaching education, that's not just about waiting for government to implement that. That's actually something that can be picked up and negotiated in the process of treaty making. But the First Peoples Assembly has now committed to looking at treaties in a complex way. So there may be statewide treaty and localized treaties as well. So it's all unfolding and still pretty unknown, but pretty exciting.
Undoubtedly.
I think also that some of the feedback we've received from community has been about the importance of truth-telling between communities as well, not just between communities, Aboriginal communities in the state, but also this being a healing opportunity for Aboriginal communities who have a really complex history with each other.
Yeah, I'd like to pick up that point if I get a chance to ask another question, but there are so many others coming through. Here's another from the audience. I lived in Canberra for 14 years and was very surprised that Acknowledgement of Country was used at all school assemblies. I worked for the federal government too, and we always did this at the beginning of every meeting as well. It felt disingenuous, as we acknowledged we were on traditional lands, but had no intention of giving them back. I've started it here at the county or shire level because there is such a disconnect that we are on traditional land. Is it a step in the right direction, or is it disingenuous? I think the acknowledgement.
Again, quite an interesting question. And I feel like you somewhat answered that in the rest of your response, in terms of the fact that while it may be seen as disingenuous or this kind of token gesture, the fact that you have started doing it in your own shire, and see that as a way of raising awareness of the fact that you're on Indigenous lands is kind of an answer in itself. I definitely there's kind of a worded acknowledgement of country that people definitely kind of just read out off a piece of paper, and it does feel very disingenuous. However, some people do kind of, I like it much more when people kind of go off script and speak from the heart, and you can tell that they actually are recognizing that they are on Aboriginal land. I think an acknowledgement of country does play an important role in awareness raising. It is probably better to have than not to have. I would say that a lot of people, the fact that it's in schools, that it's done at government levels, that it's done in businesses, in organizations, means that surely there can't be many people within Australia who don't know that they're on Indigenous land. So it at least has that goal. However, I do agree with the point about it being a bit disingenuous in terms of having no intention to give land back. I would like to see an acknowledgement of country taking place parallel to a process where we're also righting some of those wrongs and historic injustices, which hopefully, and ongoing injustices, which is hopefully what the Truth-Telling Commission and the treaties will do.
And I mean, just to connect those two in some future would be to ask, is it possible that the process leading to a treaty solution would indeed give land back or give back something tangible to Aboriginal communities?
I think in terms of what could come out of this, it's incredibly open-ended. So there is land rights legislation. Initially, a lot of the Aboriginal activism particularly through the 70s was focused on land rights. And some of you will know that Australia's entire legal framework before 1992 for its land ownership was based on this fiction that it was uninhabited land. It was called terra nullius. And only in 1992 was that overturned. So there has been progress in land rights in some ways in what's called the native title legislation framework, but that has been also very limited, and particularly limited in Victoria, where one of the requirements is to show an ongoing connection with land, which many, as Georgia explained, many people can't do because of what happened during colonisation. So I think land rights, access to resources and control of resources, economic empowerment. There's many dimensions that I think is going to be part of what the job of this body is, to look at what things could actually help address both that historic dimension as well as the ongoing ones, and how can that be put in place that can then be picked up through treaty. So yeah, I think it's still very open to see where this could go.
Caitlyn, when we read your bio, I take note that you have experience in other parts of the world in similar situations. Now, granted, of course, the context is unique in each one of these places. So not to extrapolate too broadly, but I would be curious to hear from you, given your experience specifically in certain places and broadly your professional experience in truth and justice and reconciliation issues. What are some of the things that we have learned throughout the years in these kinds of processes, number one, and number two, how are those now coming into the context in Victoria, and how are they being used as you launch this very ambitious process?
Yeah, I mean, there's now been at least 40 different truth and reconciliation commissions around the world. And of course, there's hundreds, if not thousands, of informal truth-telling processes or other forms of transitional justice efforts to reckon with difficult pasts that have taken place. Some of those are official, with government backing and stamp and resources, but many take place at community level and take place through theatre and other cultural or artistic expressions. So, some of it's oral history keeping. I mean, there's so much here that could be potentially be under that umbrella. And I think one of the lessons that has been learned from different countries' experiences is that the more you can take a multidisciplinary approach to this, and recognizing this is not just the domain of lawyers, for example, in particular, speaking as a lawyer, that's one of the big lessons that, that question we had right at the beginning about how to engage the public and how to capture the public imagination has been, I think, a really key thing that the early truth commissions that took place, particularly in Latin America after the military dictatorships ended, didn't focus on so much. They were much more kind of leading to prosecutions. This was initial investigations that gathered evidence and then ultimately were seen as precursors to prosecutions. We've seen other truth commissions that have been part of peace agreements, and that's been the case in places like Sierra Leone, where you've had that or even in South Africa. I mean, it was part of the political deal to end the conflict or hand over power, and that was to agree that we would have some kind of process. But some of those then involved other complications around giving amnesties to people in return for testifying. So that's a very different sort of experience to what we are looking at here. But I think the bigger lessons overall that have come out from the last at least 3 decades worth of practice in this area is that if these things are going to succeed, they actually have to put victims and survivors' experiences at the center. They can't just be the subjects of this, or the objects of this, sorry. They actually need to be consulted with and involved in the design from the very beginning, and that needs to inform the entire way the process operates. And that's really about legitimacy. If it's not legitimate for the people it's intended to serve, then ultimately what's the point? And so I think that's been a really key lesson. I think connected to that is, as Georgia had flagged earlier, these are traumatic stories. Even the consultations, even the discussions internally in our office about this, it brings up very deep personal stories of trauma that have been passed on. People get extremely emotional, even when they're working at a technical level on this. So recognizing the need for psychosocial mental health support, those kinds of additional services to support people who are coming forward to participate in the process. That's been another really key learning that's not just from truth commissions, but also from things like the International Criminal Court or other places where, we see this in our normal domestic court system, right? That there's been victims of crime recognizing the importance of victim impact statements or support to them. But that's also, I think, really key to the success of this. And then I think that broader conversation around connecting back with not just lawyers, but media, but arts and culture, and how to actually build a new set of values and a shared understanding of history that has been very long denied. So I think they're kind of some of the big things, but that participatory dimension and the legitimacy and the need to make sure this is removed, even though it's political to a degree in terms of you need a political commitment to get it up and running, it needs to also operate independently of day-to-day political concerns. So a lot depends on commissioner selection and making, a lot of truth commissions have run into trouble because they haven't got that right. And if they miss that initial legitimacy, it's hard to recover from that. So our process here is trying to look at those lessons. The fact that the First Peoples Assembly went out to community and asked for input, what do you want this process to achieve right from the beginning, and have been, holding the pen throughout the process is already a commitment to trying to take those things into consideration. And that's even more vital than in every other circumstance when you're talking about First Nations experiences. And that's what the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People is really focused on, about that. That's what self-determination in practice is actually meaning.
Caitlyn and Georgia, I'm just going to quick pause for a moment and tell the audience that my colleague Julie Heaton has chatted in a note that just says, if you would like to receive some follow-up information from this. So after every event, those who choose can receive a follow-up email with additional information on this issue. A lot of from Caitlyn and Georgia directly. If you're interested, I just want to assure people we don't take your email addresses and put them onto a giant mailing list. And so if you would like to get some information, please chat that into Julie or your email address. I think we have time for one, possibly two more questions. Here's another one from the audience, which is there and this is a quoted, trauma-informed approach recognized in Australia that is specific to the experiences of Aboriginal people, such as we have here?
I'd be interested to know if anyone can follow up on that. What the trauma-informed approach is in the States. Is that some kind of? Because I think the answer to that is possibly no. Caitlyn?
Yeah, I'm not sure that there is a consistent understanding that is specific to. I mean, there's a lot of people obviously who do work in this area, but I think it's still a relatively new area. And in terms of really understanding what, what the nature of intergenerational trauma in a context where that reality is still not recognised, what that actually translates into in terms of more concrete practical support. So I think that is going to be a challenge for the Commission to work out how to embed that throughout its practices and its procedures. It is a requirement for the commissioners to all be able to demonstrate that they are trauma informed and have some level of understanding, but I think it would be great to learn from other experiences in that regard.
It's definitely a conversation that's happening within the Aboriginal community. It's one of the primary conversations that we're having in our consultation is how do we ensure that this is trauma informed, and how do we ensure that it isn't going to re-traumatize people because of the really harsh reality of the violent colonization of Australia and people sharing those stories. Yeah, but in terms of a national approach or any kind of approach, I think that's a great idea. And if anyone has any resources they want to share with us, then I would love to read them.
Yeah, please, to the person who brought that question up, if you have any more information, please feel free to chat it in directly to Georgia and Caitlyn, or to all of us. I think we're all very interested. She's the viewer says, I have resources, so that should be coming your way soon.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's excellent. And just to let people know, I did receive a chat message saying that the person said they're not aware of anything like this going on in Montana. And so far, I don't think we know of anything. There was a number of chats in the promotional social media that were asking the same questions. And the answers that were coming back were, no, we don't know of anything like this here in Montana. I have another question for you. In your opening remarks, you mentioned that the commission itself has a very strong political backing, and that you mentioned, Caitlyn, it has strong coercive powers and can compel testimony. So it's not just a group of people; it has some strength and power to it. But then you also mentioned, Caitlyn, some truth and reconciliation commissions have been a precursor to prosecution. So is it also a potential outcome of this that there is actual prosecution of individuals for crime that emerges through the process?
So this commission does not have the power to recommend prosecution. And so that's really not the focus of this, partly because of the historical focus, that's not really that realistic, but also it's much more focused in terms of its follow-up actions in terms of systemic reform and very fundamental systemic reform, including reform of the criminal justice system, but also of potentially health and child protection systems and many other aspects of government policy. So it is a bit different, but that's also reflective of the nature that this is not a truth commission after, say, a short civil war or something where you've got immediate individual perpetrators right there. So, but that was something that the negotiations with the state government was the decision was to focus on that broader reform rather than prosecutions. That said, there is still the potential for individual stories of the role of individuals, whether historic or not, to come in. And so I think in terms of the acknowledgement and and what gets done with that, whether that's other forms of justice aside from prosecutions, whether that's the same debates that are playing out across the US in terms of Confederate statues. I mean, renaming of sites, how memorialization of key individuals in Australia, in Victoria's history, has taken place. I think all of those things are also potentially on the table.
That's absolutely fascinating. I mean, keeping in mind, of course, that you're at the very beginning of a very ambitious and can I say very courageous process. And of course, you can't, predetermine the outcomes of this. And in the participatory approach that is, really at the foundation of this, you have to allow for things to emerge as you develop this process, as the commission begins its work. So it must be an absolutely fascinating time to be a part of this. And so, I mean, I just want to thank you so much for coming on and sharing your views. It's something that here again in Montana, particularly that we're very interested in, and we want to know more. And I think that's reflected in a lot of the questions. I want to encourage again, any participants out there, the viewers, if you want to get your an email with additional information, chat it into me or to Julie. So before wrapping up, I would be very happy to just hand it back to you, Georgia, back to you, Caitlyn, for any last words on this process, words to us here in Montana or otherwise. Over to you.
Georgia?
Look, I had a really interesting conversation earlier with another Aboriginal employee at the Assembly who really managed to sum up what the truth-telling process was. I think that we can get caught up in these processes as being quite political, and it's really important to think about what this actually means for Aboriginal people. And what this particular woman was saying was that some community members were feeling a little bit hesitant about engaging with the process because of its close ties with government, the fact that government had a hand in setting it up and was resourcing it. And her answer was kind of just around the fact that being able to pass on trauma, the fact that Aboriginal people have been passing on trauma and passing on these stories to each other, as Caitlyn mentioned earlier, generally orally passed down generation to generation. And that it would be great if that didn't have to happen. It would be great if our stories were in the public realm and we didn't have to cause re-traumatization of explaining these kind of stories to our children. So she was saying herself that the reason that she wants to engage in the process is because she doesn't want to hand this trauma down to her children. She wants to be able to offload it in a process like this, and that will allow the whole of Victoria to kind of share in that trauma and heal and move forward. So I think just bringing it back to its roots and remembering why something like this is happening and why it's so important to the Aboriginal community is probably a good point to end on. So thank you so much.
Caitlyn?
And just from me, Chris, I guess to connect back to your mission there of connecting Montana to the world, I think it's really important for an initiative like this in one state of Australia to also connect out to the rest of the world too, because I think it is about, and as a non-Aboriginal Australian, it is such a privilege to be able to be contributing to, and I think it is a moment in history of reckoning with our past, and that's something that all countries have and all societies have at different points. And so recognizing that that we need to be very careful about our assumptions of where we see ourselves in relation to other places. And this has always been part of Australia's dark and unspoken history. And you have that, many other countries have that. And the more that we can share those experiences and be learning from each other and bringing that into the light can only make us all the better for it.
Well, Caitlyn and Georgia, that's a great way to wrap it up. I want to tell you that I'm getting all kinds of thank you messages from the viewers and participants here. And I want to give my thanks to both of you for coming from Cuba and from Melbourne all the way here to Montana to share with us this incredible process, the experience that you bring to it. It really does relate very directly to our experience here in America and specifically in Montana with the Indigenous communities here. And so I want to thank you very much for that. And what I'd like to do now is just very quickly wrap up for tonight. In line with all of the thanks, of course, I need to thank our very generous sponsors who help us bring these events to you every week. That is the Dennis and Phyllis Washington Foundation, Stockman Bank, and Allegiance. Now, next up, everybody, again, next Tuesday night, same time, 6 p.m., same Zoom link. You don't need a new one. We have Dexter Tiff Roberts, our own Tiff Roberts here from Montana. Tiff is a China expert and an author, and he's recently written a book called The Myth of Chinese Capitalism. His talk is called Unequal and Unbalanced, China's Challenge. Talk about a very timely topic given, the Anchorage summit of 2 weeks ago between the United States and China, preceded, of course, by the visit of the Secretaries of State and Defense to Japan, talking not in small part on China issues. So you really won't want to miss Tiff Roberts joining us next Tuesday evening at 6 p.m. I want to encourage everybody who's out there to please drop me a line by email. Let me know what you think about this program, other topics you'd like us to see pick up, other things you'd like us to say or to do, because again, what we're trying to do here is connect this to issues that are important to Montana and to Montanans. And I would have to say that this issue tonight, Caitlyn and Georgia, was spot on. So once again, thanks to both of you. Thank you all to our viewers and participants. Wish you all well and hope to see you next Tuesday. Until then, bye-bye.